Welcome to this evening's Wheaton conversation with Judith Schaechter and Jeff Zimmer. I'm Marcy Peterson, Marketing Technology Director at WheatonArts and Cultural Center. Briefly, I'm going to touch on a few ways to support WheatonArts, and that is through a membership, which has its own benefits, and donations, and shopping at shop.wheatonarts.org. Please consider exploring these options so we can bring you more free programs like this one. I also would like to thank our sponsors, PNC Arts and AACG, our Alliance for Contemporary Glass, for their support. And I wanted you to know that we will take the months of July and August off, but we'll be back with a full schedule in September. As I said, we will continue to engage with these conversations in September. And I wanted to also let you know that I'll be monitoring the chat. I'm going to go off screen so you can be fully engaged with Judith and Jeff. However, I'll be there for you if you have any technical questions and to offer some links. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest this evening. Judith Schaechter lives and works in Philadelphia. Her work is collected internationally and is represented in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Victoria and Albert in London, and the Hermitage, along with others. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2005, and her work was in the Brittany Biennial. Judith was also inducted to the College of Fellows of the American Craft Council. Recently, Judith's work was the subject of a retrospective exhibition organized by the Memorial Art Gallery of Rochester, New York, which traveled to the Toledo Museum and the Des Moines Art Center. Thank you for being here, Judith. And Jeff Zimmer. Jeff originally trained in theater in Washington, D.C. before moving to Edinburgh, Scotland in 2004 to study glass painting. He won the 2019 British Biennial and second prize in the Coburg Prize for Contemporary Glass. That was second prize. He was the Stephen Proctor Fellow in 2014 at the Australia National University and a 2016 Fellow at the Creative Glass Center of America. His work is in the permanent collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, the European Museum for Modern Glass, Germany, the Museum of Decorative Arts, Czechia, the Glass Museum in Denmark, and the Museum of American Glass, Wheaton, in the US, and that's Millville in the US, and also the Glass Museum, Germany. He continues to teach at his new public access glass studio in Edinburgh. Again, thank you for being here, Jeff, and thank you both. And I turn it over to you now.
Marcy, thank you so much. I just want to start out, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement and say that both Marcy and I are coming to you from the ancestral land of the Lenni Lenape. In addition, I also want to thank Wheaton for making this possible and inviting us to have this conversation. Speaking for myself anyway, we're very excited. So Jeff and I, first of all, Wheaton asked me to participate, and they asked if I would choose someone. And I knew right away that I wanted to ask Jeff. And I also knew that Jeff is, it's the middle of the night where Jeff is. So I wasn't sure if he would say yes. But I'm very inspired by his work. We've been friends for over 20 years. And we've what have we done together? You took my class in Northlands, but you were vastly overqualified to be my student.
No.
Oh yes. And so I think that our work shares a kinship, so I thought we could have a decent conversation. So some of the things we're going to talk about are darkness, beauty, inspiration, and art and social issues. And we've practiced this, and we had a lot to say to each other in private, but of course, when you are having a conversation in front of, I don't know how many people, there's an element of self-consciousness. But anyway, we're gonna start with darkness. And I am going to ask Jeff, first of all, Jeff, a few years ago, you gave the most incredibly inspiring and fantastic talk at the Glass Art Society conference on darkness. I found it incredibly moving, and it really spoke to me personally. And so I wanted to ask you if you would talk a little bit, maybe give like an incredibly short synopsis of what is the take-home message from that talk, and how does it relate to your work?
Good question. Thank you, first of all, for asking me to be a part of this conversation, Judith. I'm really honored to be here with you discussing and to have been asked by Wheaton as well. Darkness is really important to my work. And it's really important to say that when I talk about darkness, I'm talking about an aesthetic darkness, but I'm also talking about a symbolic darkness. And for me, that darkness is like a nourishing, fecund place that is a place of enrichment. It's a place of, think about the seeds growing in the dark earth, thinking about people going into caves, to seek out inspiration and to experience, something that's completely other. I see that as a really creatively rich place. And it's very specifically not the darkness that we think about in a more biblical sense or in a more Enlightenment sense that stands in opposition to knowledge and openness. So I'm kind of hoping to refashion the idea of what light and darkness are and what they mean. And I kind of come at it through looking at the notion of shadow, which was, the initial really important thing for me, especially coming out of the kind of Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld years, around the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when they tried to, divide everything into good versus evil and with us or against us, and these binaries that I thought were just complete crap. And of course they were defining themselves in their drive to go into this war as the good guys, the guys on the side of lightness and freedom. And I thought, well, I really don't agree with you, and you're telling me that everybody that disagrees with you is wrong and evil. And it made me want to explore the nature of these things that they were telling me that I couldn't think about because it was too dangerous to think about in opposition to their light. And so this whole notion of ambiguity became really important to me. And it felt like ambiguity dealt much more with shadow and with darkness than with light. Even though, they're all in interplay with one another. And so, so that's kind of where I'm coming from when I'm talking about darkness and what darkness means to me. And then also there's the whole notion, you and I work in, or you're certainly closer to, I feel like I'm rooted in and coming out of a stained glass tradition, which has a very particular in relationship with light.
I was just going to ask, because stained glass people like to rhapsodize about light, and you also come from a stained glass tradition. So do you want to talk about maybe this image here in particular, and how cheeky you are to be using glass to express darkness?
Well, yes. So I love. I'll get more into this particular one, which is a black mirror, which is an optical device that's been used in a number of ways over the years. But it's one of the things that it's been seen as is kind of doing presenting a looming absence, or this thing that's both present and not present. And I love that, with this particular device, which is just, fire polished black glass, that you get a very accurate reflection, but that it's much more about the darkness, and that you can see yourself as, a creature of darkness. And I find that really, really compelling. But kind of talking about going back to the stained glass roots, this whole notion of light, I really reacted against. So when I started making the first works that I really think about as mine in terms of working with glass and coming out of the stained glass tradition, this is the kind of stuff that I did, which was inspired by a local production of Hamlet, an entirely nonverbal production of Hamlet that was done by some Georgian immigrants in Washington, D.C. And it was stunning. But I loved that, as I started to find my voice, it was really very much about blocking the light. And I thought everything interesting I'm doing with the glass is blocking light, whether it's, painting with it, there were just the pure unadulterated light was really boring. But if I made it really dark and moody, I found it very exciting for me. And so, I started doing stained glass that was about blocking as much light as possible, or controlling the light, not having the light dominate, but having it be much more in balance with the dark and the light, much more in balance together, that I found much more interesting. And talking about darkness and sleep, and I'm an insomniac, and, so kind of portraying me in the hours of darkness when I'm laying there not sleeping, but keeping my eyes closed. And it's a really fertile, imaginative time for me as well. And so, it has both of these things, this thing, it's like, well, I'm here in the darkness because I'm not asleep, and I'd really rather be asleep, but while I'm not sleeping, I'm going to let my mind wander. And a number of really good ideas come in this time of not sleeping. Those are kind of, in a nutshell, without wanting to belabor it too much, kind of the thoughts that I have about darkness, and how it's present in my work, and how it's very physically present in my work, in a really real way, all this blackness that I'm really quite fascinated with. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later when we talk about another project. But, I love exploring the ways dark and light interacts with glass, and playing across these black glass surfaces. And so, and looking at quotes of people who have also found inspiration in the dark, such as this quote, which comes from the poet Edwin Morgan, and just talking about the love that he would find as a closeted man in the darkness and hidden away from public view.
It's interesting to see someone celebrate something that is so not expected with the medium of glass.
Yeah. So your approach to Judith, to darkness, Judith, mine's often really quite literally dark. Whereas your work gets described as dark more in a kind of thematic or metaphorical sense. And, and of course, we're both coming out of this stained glass tradition, which almost fetishizes light. How do you think about darkness in your work, both metaphysical and, thematic and, physical?
Well, a lot of times, I think people have taken me to task for themes that seem negative or dark or macabre. And this is a recent piece, but the first image I was going to show is this. I take issue with it, although I feel like when I take issue with that characterization of my work, it might be a little bit disingenuous. You have to go back really far to get to the really creepy stuff that I did. So this is from 1988, and I haven't done anything this creepy since then. The second image I was going to show was a piece called Rape Serenade. This was in the exhibition that traveled in the retrospective. And when I did this piece, I was sort of being influenced by the culture of Oprah, where there was a lot of people uncovering buried memories. A lot of people were experiencing like redemption on national TV. And it was interesting to me. And also I was influenced by Stephen King, who wrote it. But anyway, that's embarrassing to admit. I think, to me, to my mind, there's nothing actually happening here. But when this piece was on exhibit, I found out that someone was very upset by it. They felt that they were triggered by it. And that, to me, that was upsetting to me, because I used to really shy away from telling anybody anything that I thought my work was supposed to be doing. But I'm getting on in years. I feel like I can't afford to waste any time. I wouldn't make anything depressing on purpose, because I don't think the world needs any more depressing stuff in it. People don't need help being depressed. They need help being not depressed, right? So I don't think of myself as macabre. I think of myself as providing a venue for people to maybe work through things that are almost unbearable to think about. I think animals being hurt, I can't imagine anything more awful ever. I'm much more okay with people getting hurt. That's my own weirdness. But animals, oh, I can hardly bear to think of it. And I think I work to aestheticize this just so that it is tolerable. But the idea isn't that one would wallow in negativity and stay there, but to maybe, dare I say it, experience some healing. I'm not going to make any claims that my pieces are healing, but maybe they are to me. So when people tell me that my work is upsetting and why would anyone do this, I think things like, well, I don't know, did you like Romeo and Juliet? Doesn't have a happy ending. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. And I also think that I think ultimately, because I grew up in the family that I did, and I know there are people here listening that this will mean something too, that I grew to understand that to process things that were really deep and dark, you had to go through them, not to repress them. And my art became a vehicle for that. So I think that is the main thing. Basically, I think ultimately, I'm trying to perform some sort of psychological alchemy here. People have a lot of feelings in life, and the feelings we do not need to analyze are like happy feelings. We don't need help when we're happy. We need help when we're suffering. And I think that art can be something that helps suffering people. I think I had some depression when I was a child, and I heard a lot of people tell me to cheer up, and I will tell you that doesn't work. so I am never going to make a work of art that tells you to cheer the hell up. So this is what you get instead. And I think I loved your lecture so much, Jeff, because you were creating an understanding of darkness that was sort of like you said about like seeds and wombs and a place of fertility and growth. And I think that's a way to understand all darkness, not just darkness. Now, I realized that I do make some windows that are kind of dark in tone. I hadn't really thought about that when considering this question. But also, there's that old quote from the Abbot Suger, who said, stained glass is enlightenment embodied. He said that in the 1200s when the Cathedral of Saint Denis, the first truly Gothic cathedral, was built. And what a great spokesperson for the medium of stained glass, but it's set up a whole lot of people expecting enlightenment every time they looked at a stained glass window. That's an awful lot of pressure there. So our next topic is beauty. Do you want to introduce
Yes. Oh, now see, I had a question. You know, it's difficult to ask you about beauty because you address it so much in your writings, in your talks, you know, in your work, and your work is, I find your work truly beautiful. You know, regardless of the subject, there is so much beauty in what you're doing, in the way you handle the material, that, you know, I just find it, I'm speechless. This piece is one of my absolute favorites of yours in terms of just sheer sensuality. But so, as one of the questions I have is, you know, so the beauty in your work, in the way you talk about your work, exists as a very sensual physical thing, but also as a very kind of intellectual exploration. And you really, you know, assert the value of beauty as, you know, as this kind of intellectual aspect, not just a physical aspect. And you know, you tease out these connections and your works and your talks. And are there any kind of unresolved issues you have about beauty, or is, you know, what are the things that, what's the kind of cutting edge of, or leading edge of your thoughts about beauty right now as you're working?
First of all, we'll get to you in a minute, but I think your work is really beautiful too. And I think we deploy beauty in a very similar way. I have so much to say. I asked Jeff if we could ask this question. So Jeff, I apologize to you because I would be intimidated to ask me this question. You know, looking at this piece, the thing that strikes me as the most beautiful of all is the sine curve running through it, which I was inordinately proud of coming up with that idea. Is there anything unresolved about beauty to me? And the answer is everything is unresolved about beauty. And that's why it's so intriguing. When Trump was elected, I noticed that, myself included, there was a call to make angry, ugly art. In protest and in response to the fact that reality and truth was getting very ugly, and it made perfect sense. And then when COVID happened, it was like we all did a Yui, and it was like, oh my God, give me something beautiful. I want to look at sunsets and sourdough bread, lots of it. And people were craving sensual aesthetic experiences, I think. And that spoke to me of the power of beauty. I think the reason I got interested in beauty, first of all, no one was more shocked than me going to art school when I was told that pretty things had no place in the arts. I mean, I think had I had any wits about me, I would have gone to the registrar and demanded a refund, because that's all I wanted to make. And I was told by white men that this was not legit. And I was told a lot of other things were not legit. I will tell you that when I look back and I really think about why was beauty so important to me, and I think I always felt unattractive as a child. When I went to school, I was teased about my appearance. I was teased about my big schnozzy nose. And I think that I understood that I could create beautiful things, and that's what I was going to use that to seduce people instead of my face and body. And when my professors told me that wasn't allowed, I just thought, I got to go ahead and do it anyway because I don't have anything else. So, oh well. Other reasons I think beauty is interesting is my personal definition of beauty, and I have come up with hundreds of them, is something like today, the definition du jour is that visual beauty happens when ugliness and prettiness are combined to be sort of irresistibly attractive. I do not think you can have beauty without ugliness as a component. What I think prettiness is no ugliness. It's very temporarily satisfying, but only temporarily. And beauty, and when I say ugliness, I very specifically mean death. I think that for something to be beautiful, death has to be part of what you're looking at. Also, one last thing I will say is I think that beauty is an excellent way to get people to look at things that they don't want to think about. So it's kind of like when I was a kid, we used to, you know, made you look. We used to say that, you know, teasing people, but getting people to look at things and contemplate things that are unpleasant. This is not unpleasant, this one. This is the Google Map pin as redesigned by me. But like say, this is an image of someone on a desert island all by themselves. So maybe that is something isolation, and it's called Isola. And it's full of snakes. So maybe someone doesn't want to be isolated on a desert island full of snakes. And yet maybe that's a perfect metaphor for your life. So one might want something, some reward for looking at it and thinking about it. So those are some of my main thoughts about beauty. I have lots more, but we will keep it at that. Now, Jeff, it's your turn. I think that your work is undescribably gorgeous. I'm just going to flip through these so people can see this series. So I wondered if you would talk about how you also combine beauty with sort of harrowing subject matter. And even in these images, they're quite serene. I love these so much. I would be so happy to have these on my wall. And also, if you don't address it, I'm going to ask you to talk just a little about the technique.
Okay. Yeah, beauty, it feels, I like to make things that I get a sense of beauty from. I remember as a kid, you know, and you know, and teenager reading about, you know, the angry periods following wars, you know, and following World War II, especially World War I, you know, where, you know, art got ugly and got brutal, and there was this sense of, you know, needing to brutalize people through artwork, or even the whole rage of the punk scene. You know, I was a bit young for that, but you know, I could, because from from childhood, I was hearing stories about the horrors of war and the Holocaust, and yet I was seeing, you know, the world being a beautiful place, you know, as you do when you're a child. And so it wasn't, you know, I didn't feel like I had this need to rage against the world. I understood that these things coexisted. And so the idea of making things that were kind of purposefully alienating or purposefully ugly, I never quite understood. The older I get, the more I do understand that very visceral need to, you know, to do that. But I think that I find ways to make things that are beautiful, and like you, to perhaps discuss things that might be a little unpleasant, might make people a bit uncomfortable. But if you put it in this beautiful package, maybe people will be comfortable sitting with that for a while. And to sit with that discomfort, I think, is something that beauty can encourage people to do. You know, it's not the only way, but it's a way that I feel like I'm kind of suited to making. And so like these images here deal with drone warfare, and the title of them is, you know, the disconnect between action and consequence. And you know, it came to me quite suddenly as I was flying, and being very aware as I was above the clouds here in Scotland, you know, what the people below the clouds here in Scotland were having to endure, and that I was separate from that because I was above it. And then you fly over a war zone and you think, I'm, you know, on my way to this holiday or this art experience, and I'm flying over a war zone, and there's these disconnects that we have. And, you know, so I started thinking about how we structure so much of society to kind of remove ourselves as much from unpleasant things as we can, and unbalanced power structures and the consequences of those. And so thinking about, you know, the way the US and the UK have, you know, engaged in drone warfare in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Yemen. And you get these political leaders who can make a decision, a continent and an ocean away, relay it to someone sitting in a trailer outside of Las Vegas who can control something that destroys lives, you know, in Yemen. And, you know, that's, you can argue about the particular moralities of that, but, you know, there's a disconnect there that I find really, really worth investigating. And I want us to question that. And I want us to question it as people who live in countries that engage in that particular military type activity, but also in any, you know, circumstance where there's an imbalance of power, you know, be it wealth, be it Western consumers and our effect on the third world through the things that we buy and consume and throw away. You know, and so these are things that I want to address. And I found that this drone, you know, hovering above these luscious, you know, cloudscapes was a really effective way to do that. But getting people to talk about, God, what's my role in this imbalance of power? I feel like I can perhaps entice people to linger in that place for a bit longer if it comes in something that's really quite beautiful and something that's beguiling, something maybe a bit mysterious.
Jeff, I think you do something very clever with the frames here, and that is you create a third character who is the art viewer, who is similarly distant as the person controlling the drone. And you do that by using this vintage frame to call attention to the basically the fourth wall that art creates, and it's very meta of you. Do you want to speak about that a little bit? Do you want me to change the picture?
Sure. Let's go to the next one here.
There we go.
Yeah. So it's funny. The frames actually came out of the series immediately prior to this, which was addressing polarization. And I was thinking very specifically about Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld for that. And I was thinking about, you know, I used to live in Washington, D.C., and you go on tours of the State Department, of the White House, of the Capitol, and, you know, there's art on all the walls. And all of that art is hung in big, chunky gold frames. And, you know, you think, well, there's this, if I can make a reference to this art that these people will have seen, that exists in places where they think, this is the art that I can respect. I like this thing that's on the wall here, as opposed to that left-wing stuff that's out, you know, in the museums. This is this is real art. And it comes in big chunky frames. And I specifically wanted to reference that big chunky frame thing to say, well, this is something you should be paying attention to as well. Specifically, you know, in my mind's eye, those three were the ideal audience for those pieces.
Well, they're not gold, they're black.
Yeah, you know, sorry, I couldn't do the gold.
No, I think it's perfect.
Too much color.
Yeah, I agree. I think the gold would be distracting. And do you want to say just a little about how these are made for people who might not know?
Yes, so these are all hand painted on many layers of clear glass, except this one, these water droplet looking things are film formed. Yeah, okay. So this is all on clear glass, low iron float glass, if you want to get technical. And there's probably, I forget how many, say 12 layers of glass in this. So it does actually shift and move as you move around it. And it's all, you know, I usually paint from photographs, but this is all hand painted work. That's painted, fired on in the kiln, bring it out, paint a little bit more on, fire it on in the kiln again. You know, each layer goes through the kiln maybe, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, however many times it takes to get the balance of tones right and the composition right. And, you know, so it's a really laborious process.
Audience people, you must see these in person. Next to the word evocative in the dictionary is a picture of one of these. All right, I'm going to move on to our next topic, which is that of inspiration. And I will introduce it by saying every single artist who gets interviewed gets asked, where do you find your inspiration? And I feel like it's no judge would convict if you go postal on these people. But everyone wants to know. I want to know from other artists how they get their inspiration too. And I'll tell you, because I teach this class at Pennsylvania Academy called Creativity and Inspiration, right? And I will tell you, I'm no closer to understanding inspiration than I was before. First of all, psychologists don't write about inspiration. Mystics write about inspiration. That's not very useful. We need more fMRIs, please. But what I will say is sometimes I think inspiration has to do with getting an idea. Then of course I'm stuck trying to define what in the hell is an idea. The more I know, the less I know. I don't know what an idea is. If an artwork has to be at least 1,000 ideas before it can be anything. So we have sort of provisional ways of discussing these things. And I wondered, Jeff, if you could tell us a little bit about ideas and inspiration. One question, I think there's basically 2 kinds of artists, and then or maybe there's a spectrum with 2 ends, 2 polarities.
There are no binaries, Judith.
Right, so there's a lot in the middle. So there is, on one end would be artists who have an idea and then make it. And then on the other side are artists who are finding their way through the materials to an idea that happens at the end of the process. So talk to us about ideas and inspirations, Jeff.
Wow, okay, so you've just described 2 of the different approaches that I'm about to talk about.
Good.
That have both happened with me. So, you know, for me, I work in glass because it's where my ideas tend to flow. So there is something about the medium, about its association, about its interaction with light, about the way I learn something about it when I use it, that my ideas flow really readily with glass in a way that they wouldn't with paper or canvas or whatever material. You know, or poetry or film. You know, I don't think in those ways, but glass, I've been working with it so long that plays a part of it, and that's always kind of, that's like the underscore going on under everything that I do. But so yeah, so I wanted to talk about a couple different projects that had really different approaches to the way they were inspired. So the first set was that I'll talk about is what I call my whitewash series. And these were literally came into my head within the course of an afternoon. And, you know, maybe even shorter than that. But in 2010, it snowed in Edinburgh, and it doesn't snow here very much. And I love snow. Being one of these people who has always lived in snow-deprived areas, I love it. So as soon as there's any bit of it, I run out and I'm like, snow! Ah! So, you know, so that's thing number 1. Thing number 2 is the neighborhood that we live in. Lord love it. It's not the loveliest. It's a bit grim. And, you know, as you walk down the pavement, there's dog shit on the sidewalks, and there's, you know, crisp packets and beer cans and bin bags and, you know, all of that. It's just kind of there. It's not lovely. But the snow came. And, suddenly I'm out and what am I doing? I'm taking pictures. My neighborhood is suddenly stunning and all the neighbors are out and they're all taking pictures. And it's this suddenly transformed, beautiful space that has this whitewash of snow. And as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, God, this place is usually so grim and uninspiring. And now everywhere I turn, my eyes are open to something new and it was amazing. And then it hit me, it's like, well, actually, the dog shit's still under there. And, the beer can's still in the gutter and the crisp packets are under there somewhere as well. And it got me thinking that, the way this snow is the way we are as humans in terms of the way we whitewash ourselves. That, we've all done something wrong. We all have something that, kind of makes us worthy of, that probably, someone could judge us really harshly for. Yet we still want to present ourselves as good and worthy of love, worthy of respect, even though, all of us are the arch villain in someone's life story. And, we probably deserve to be, but we don't want to present that. And so, this snow covering the shit made me think about, so that became this metaphor that suddenly just came together into works that look like this, where there's these snowscapes and the snowscapes are obscuring things that are not pleasant. They're not, they're not lovely. There's pollution, there's bin bags, there's rubbish everywhere. But, they're still, because they're covered with this luminous snow, there's this kind of beauty to them. And I want them to kind of have that duality embodied in them of this ugliness and this beauty. And my hope is that, because we can look at ourselves and see, I'm a bit of a shit, and I've done this thing to this person. I'm not proud of that. Please love me, despite that. And we do that for ourselves, but we don't always extend that generosity to others. And so, my actual thought behind these is that, if we can admit that we're imperfect and still worthy of love, hopefully we can do that to other people. And I do that by having imperfect landscapes that I hope people will still fall in love with. And so that's kind of one way of inspiration that came as a wallop. It might have come in an instant. I don't know. But it was this just thing that was overwhelming. And then I worked on that for years.
So you do believe in divine inspiration then? I gotcha.
Did I say divine?
Okay.
I'm
Words.
not sure. Did it come from a creature in my wall? I don't know. So there was that. Then the other type of inspiration is the slide that you just went to. A couple of years ago, I was inspired by Bullseye Project, or I was invited by Bullseye Projects to make a work for this space, which is their buyer space up in Caithness, which is a place I love, 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 love. And I had seen the prior exhibition here and loved it. Michael Rogers was in this room, Carlin Sutherland, Sylvia Levinson, Emily. Just an amazing, amazing space. And I was really excited to be asked to be a part of it. And I had no idea what the heck I would do. Absolutely no clue. And there were 2 years that I had to figure this out. And I thought about it for 2 years and nothing came together. And, 6 months before, it had to be installed, I'm suddenly like, right, okay. This space was attached to a minister's house. And a Victorian minister. And I thought, well, as a queer person in this space, I have been invited by the current owners of it to be a part of this, but the original owner would have probably hated that, probably would have thought that it was the most evil thing. And here I was coming into his space. And so I decided that maybe I would turn it into an exploration of the lives of queer people in that area of Scotland, very remote area of Scotland. And, so then once you do that, well, then you think, well, what do I do? What do I do? And then, so the next slide, please. So one of the first things I did, I'd been at a residency at Bullseye Projects, or at the Bullseye Factory in Portland. And, one of the people working there is like, oh, have you ever made frit balls? And they're just these, you put little clumps of glass in the kiln, you melt them, and they form these balls that are luminous. And it's like, oh, if I make them purple and pink, that's like pink glitter. That's like, I'm going to use that, and I thought, I want to use this to christen the space. I want to use this, I'm going to rub it into all of the flagstones so that this becomes a queer space, so that it becomes a threshold over which you have to pass in order to enter this space. It was this minister's, now for the time of this exhibition, it's mine, and you're entering my queer space. And so doing that, and then, kind of working these down in between the flagstones, I hope they become a part of the permanent archaeology of the place, so that, in 200 years, if someone digs this up, they're like, what's all this purple stuff? Purple, purple and pink, those were queer colors back in the 21st century. Maybe this was a queer space, and so that idea happened. And then next slide. And then I thought, well, I don't want it to be about me. I'm not from here. So I started interviewing LGBT people from in and from Caithness, and started making works about some of the stories that they would tell me. So, so I was making these much more usual for me, painted, illuminated landscapes that would deal with some of the stories that I was hearing. So there's about 5 of these dotted around the space, not littered. And then the next slide. So one of the things that came up when I was talking with people is that there was a kind of simultaneous presence and absence that they had in their queerness in Caithness. And they were definitely there and present, but they kind of lived their lives with a bit of a cover, a bit of a camouflage, and certainly not all of them, but there was this idea of being present and not present, and that's where these black mirrors really came into being for me. Is that one of the aspects of the black mirrors was they were seen to represent presence and absence together in the same thing. And I thought, putting these all around the space will bring that to the fore. And some of them are black glass, some of them are in dark lavender glass. So, it reads almost as a black with a lavender taint to it. And so you're kind of seeing yourself as present and absent and maybe a little bit queered, and, and so kind of putting these through the space so that as you're going through, you're seeing yourself in the space as well. And then the next slide, please. So I wanted to extend that further and started looking at, gay Scottish poets or queer Scottish poets, and came across this guy, Edwin Morgan, who is poet laureate of Glasgow, now deceased, who didn't come out of the closet until his 70th birthday. And so he had all of these beautiful poems that, these sensual love poems that everybody had assumed in the 60s and 70s were about a woman. It's like, no, they were all about a man, and they all deal with this kind of beautiful idea of darkness. And so I thought, well, this is, a very Scottish thing that I can bring into this space and extend that, all the stories that I'd heard into these phrases that could be, present and disappear with the light. So it was a very organic thing led by the material that developed over the course of months and months, and with a great deal of panic because there was a deadline. Which is a great way of being inspired as well. Get a deadline. That'll inspire anybody.
Absolutely. Well,
So,
I hope everyone is noticing how these topics are starting to merge. Darkness, inspiration, beauty, they're all the same. They're all different.
yeah, now I was really interested, as Judith and I talked about this in advance of this this talk today. Judith, you shared some ideas about inspiration that I found really challenging, that were more really about where inspiration comes from and what's the source of inspiration, not necessarily a walking through of here's how I was inspired to create these pieces, but the whole process of inspiration. You had some really interesting thoughts on, and would you care to share where you think inspiration comes from, or to talk about that?
Sure, Jeff. It comes from the inspiration bunny. Everyone knows that. I don't remember what I said. Whatever I said before is gone.
There was it was about a Roman idea of it.
That's from that Elizabeth Gilbert TED Talk.
Yes.
I got very interested in inspiration because my experience of inspiration has been more like your first version, which is that it can come in flashes of insight. But having read a lot about it, I will say it certainly favors the prepared mind. The dude who figured out the benzene molecule was a chemist. He wasn't, he wasn't a CPA. Anyway, I would say inspiration is hard for me because I always wanted, it's something that I can't make happen. I can make a stained glass window happen under any and all circumstances. If there's a deadline, stained glass windows can happen. But can I be inspired? That is something separate, and I'm really interested. Sometimes I think it's just me being really excited. Is that what inspiration is? And then I got interested in ideas of divine inspiration, even though I'm an atheist, because I'm sure that if they ever, the thing about biology is that it's every bit as magical and mysterious as mysticism is. It's, you can call it neurons and you can call it divine. What's the difference? Really, it's just two different words. So usually when I talk about inspiration, I like to make it a point of saying that I am very inspired by the material of stained glass. This is sort of a joke image to choose to show because it is pictures of glass. I am inspired by the glass, and I don't plan my ideas ahead of time. The other thing I'm very inspired by is drawing. And I read about visionary artists. I've read a lot about visionary artists, and it seems that there's maybe a myth. Maybe it's partially true. There needs to be more studies of this too. That, there's a class of artistic people who are seeing things in their head, and then they are, it comes out the other end of a pen. Now that is not my experience when I draw or create at all. When I am drawing, I am seeing it and thinking of it for the very first time is when it becomes external. There's not really a picture in my head. Sometimes, like, I've seen something and thought, oh, that's a good idea for a piece, file that for later, and then tried to draw it. But more and more, when I draw, I do sort of automatic doodling. Like, I don't try to control my drawings, they just come out. So this drawing here, which was, like this big in a notebook, was the impetus for this piece. And I remember when I drew it, humble and lousy a drawing as it is, I knew immediately that this was going to be a killer piece. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. And so I didn't have a figure, and this figure had a different background. And so I work in Photoshop a lot, and that's where I'm getting inspired, is in Photoshop and in the glass studio. And this was one of my original ideas for how to resolve this figure, which I was interested in making. And ultimately, this resolution up here ended up here. So my ideas tend to cross-pollinate when they're in the sketch phase and in the glass phase. So I don't have a full drawing when I'm making glass. So I had this, it was gonna go with this figure. But something else happened and it became this piece, which is called Io the Cow-Faced Maiden. And that is from a character from Prometheus Bound. And ultimately, I had drawn all these little droopy flowers in vases, and I had executed this figure in glass. So it was already made, and it was just sitting around in a Tupperware bin waiting for a good idea to finish it. And I realized that the flowers were drooping and she was drooping, and that would be a really terrific combination. So that's how this piece got realized. I also just wanted to talk briefly about this piece. If anyone is in the Philadelphia area, this is currently on exhibit at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in their exhibition called Nude Grit. I'm forgetting to look at the camera, so I'll make up for it. One of the things that's most important to me with regards to inspiration is to work from my imagination. When I went to art school, at first I was a painting major, and the first semester we painted from nude models and still lives. The second semester of our sophomore year, the professor said, okay, you can now paint anything you want for the rest of your life. And every single person worth their salt in that class had a huge emotional crisis immediately upon being told that. And I remember thinking, I want to work from my imagination, but I didn't have any idea what was in there. I would say it's very important to me these days to invent my own birds and flowers. I use them over and over again, but they are invented by me. So that's important to me and somehow relates to inspiration. I can see that the time is ticking away, so I'm going to move the conversation forward. The last subject we wanted to talk about, I specifically wanted to talk about, is social issues and using art as a platform for things of that nature. And as I said, when I was talking about beauty, I was really struck by the difference in response to Trump's election and then to the pandemic and how it affected art. I know that when Trump was elected, I felt like my art was the most indulgent in the world. And I needed to address social issues. And I felt like a lot of artists do, but I still feel intensely ambivalent about that as an artist. And Jeff, that's one of the reasons I asked you to talk. Is it is so important to your work and you do it so eloquently. So could you say a few words?
Well, thank you. All of my work is a conversation or an imagined conversation, you know, that at least takes place in my head. But I always imagine that I'm making something to engage with someone else or many other people, or you know, or whatever, and it's rarely actually defined specifically, but you know, I want it to be a conversation. And so I have to think about, you know, what I have to say. And most of the things that I feel like I have to say in that kind of public realm are political, you know, or political or social, or, you know, or something like that. You know, it's, it also, you know, it takes a long time for me to make my work. And so I have to have an idea that's going to keep me interested long enough to actually see it through. Because there's, you know, my studio is littered with pieces that I've started and I've been like, nah, no, boring. Can't, you know, can't even bother. You know, I don't throw them away, but, you know, you can't bother to finish with it because the idea just doesn't see me through. I'm aware that, you know, as a gay man, like my life is political. My life is politicized. You know, there are political, you know, there are people who make decisions about how I can move through the world, whether, you know, what legal rights I have, that other people don't necessarily get, or, you know, or have to deal with. So if I'm going to talk about my love for my first lover, it's actually a political piece because it exists in a political sphere against a very political backdrop. You know, and I'm aware that I'm certainly not unique in that way at all, but it's really present in my mind that the personal is political. and for me, I make work that has a political message as a form of engagement. I don't necessarily think that politically engaged work, changes the world, but maybe it can help affect the tone or tenor of a conversation. Maybe, it could be the icon that does galvanize people around an idea. But if there's not a lot of us out there making it, that work like that doesn't evolve in a vacuum. And as an artist, I could go out and I could write an essay, or I could do Facebook posts about what I think. But as an artist, part of the way I communicate is through my work. And so for me, it's important, for all of those reasons, it's important that my work has a message. And what that is, changes from piece to piece. But kind of being aware that time's moving on, I won't go on any longer. But that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Well, I think this piece is really moving. I think both of us were really affected by the AIDS pandemic. And it's interesting that here we are, Pride Month, and discussing a piece about the AIDS pandemic. And I personally know a lot more people who died of AIDS than COVID. I just, it's really beautiful. Thanks, Jeff.
So I should have had us, scroll through these. These are just kind of other things that I'm working on, where I'm thinking about identity, and where I'm thinking about the use of identity and identity politics, and what do you do with with your identity, and how the ways in which, like a brick, it can be used in many, many different ways, and the way you can use that destructively or constructively. And also just to make really pretty things with glass, because these are bricks, but there is, and there's meant to be quite a beauty about them. Again, it's lots of layers of color all joined together. So yes, so Judith, you kind of described your work as not having, I'll say this badly, but it's kind of not being political. And in a way, I would challenge you on that, because I think your work, as your body also being a political body, your work has always been about you as a woman having a voice and putting your inner life out there, these complex emotions, and owning them fully, and saying these occupy this extraordinary stage that you create and that you put out into the world. And the fact that you do that as a woman, putting yourself out there like that, I have always found very politically strong. And also the fact that I always sense that the figures in your pieces are underdogs in a way, that they are not the powerful. You are taking people whose lives are going through some kind of crisis or transition, and who aren't who don't seem to have a lot of power, and you're presenting them in ways that make them bold and present, and unashamedly present, occupying our space with their bodies and their griefs or their emotions. And I see that as really political. Do you also get a sense of that?
I don't think I knew what I was doing for a long time. That's a great question. I changed to this slide. I don't like to own my relationship to these characters necessarily. Like, is this me writhing in ecstasy? I feel like that's none of your damn business. But yes, in some ways it is. They're not self-portraits. They might be proxies for me, but also I think in some ways I make the most female art that I can possibly imagine in some ways. It's yeah, and I think that bothers people sometimes. I went to see the 50 Americans show at the Barnes, which is 50 African-American artists before COVID. And it was all figurative. And I mean, it's funny because when you are a political body, I guess it's an irresistible urge to make people look at it. And so I've been asked, you know, before like in the 1980s and 90s, I remember people saying, why are your characters all female? And it seemed like an absolutely absurdly ridiculous question. It's because I am one. Why else? But anyway, I chose different pictures to show for this because I was concerned with climate change, and I wanted to bring a political message to my work a little bit. I always feel that art is so intimate, and that it's not an arena sport or a rock show taking place in Madison Square Garden. You're only addressing 2 or 3 people in front of one of my pieces, because that's how many people can stand in front of it at a time. And I really think that if you are trying to be persuasive, which I'm not really either, I agree with you there, then you're only going to persuade one person at a time. Unlike, you know, Bono going like this on stage, it's going to convert a lot of people all at once. And I wanted to show this piece, which is very recent, and it's also very large for me. This was my response to the summer of 2020. By the way, just as an aside, it is an endlessly repeating pattern, so that this person here continues over here. This person's head appears down here. So this goes on forever. This was about, in my mind, it's called Raft of the Medusa because the famous Jericho painting depicts a whole bunch of people on a raft trying to survive. A lot of people see this as people really just fighting each other, but there's actually some tender moments in the piece that I wanted to point out, more than one. And I wanted to use the idea of the Raft of the Medusa as a metaphor for the raft planet Earth, where humankind is struggling to get along and not necessarily doing a great job. It doesn't escape my notice that people were willing to protest for Black Lives Matter when they were basically risking their lives to do so. And I wanted to say something about it, I didn't want to say anything critical. Like I have no gripe against the fact that people have a hard time getting along. That seems sort of obvious to me. But I wanted to say it with love and hopefully with some kindness. So those are my thoughts on that. And it's 7:10, so those are all the slides we have. So I'll stop sharing. I have no idea if anyone has any questions or if we have time, but maybe Marcy would like to intervene and.
Yes, we do have some questions, and I did just recently remind people to ask their questions in the Q&A feature, but Susan so aptly put it that she's been so captivated, even myself. I was thinking the same thing, that the conversation has been so captivating that it's hard to take the moment to consider questions. So hopefully, while I'm rambling on here for the moment, that it gives people a pause to think about those questions. Now, there was a question earlier about one of the asking whether the stained glass window was hand painted, but I think that we can. I think you've talked about it being hand painted, but do you want to talk about your process? I mean, is it all color? Is it all clear? Do you want to touch on that a little bit before I go to the other questions?
I can answer that real fast. The glass is called flash glass. It has 2 layers. It's engraved and it's painted and it's stacked. If there's a difficult process, then I want to get involved and do it. All of it is hand done. I don't use very many mechanical reproductive processes anymore. Like basically my printer won't make negatives. So I just do everything by hand. I love drawing. I love working with my hands. If the more difficult, the more fun I'm having. So it's all basically carved into the glass and painted. But the only paint I use is black and yellow. That's the end. Thank you.
The only paint you use is black and yellow.
The glass,
Oh, there.
the other colors are in the glass. I use a lot of red and blue glass because red, blue, and yellow are the primary colors. You can get everything with them.
Wow, that's fabulous. Very interesting. I am a very process-oriented person. So,
Well, I could give you a
so
whole
do you
lecture
want to talk
on that, but I won't.
do you want to, Jeff, would you like to talk a little bit about your process as far as the glass at all? Do you want to touch on that?
I think I touched a bit about, how I make the painted imagery, certainly. So, the again, like Judith, they're all hand painted on lots of layers of glass. Lately, primarily because of this invitation from Bullseye, I've been getting more into kiln forming glass, which is kind of opening horizons for me. I didn't want to let go of having everything be, my painted illuminated work. And I'm finding it's really fascinating. So, so there's some new techniques creeping in, which I'm really loving. Although I do, a couple of the pieces were laser engraved, because I do make extensive use of that lately, which is really fascinating.
Great. Susan another Susan asked a question about what about the casual nature of your drawings, rendering in that manner. Judith, I'm not exactly sure what that means, and I don't know if you want to go ahead and take it up, but what about the casual nature of your drawing, rendering in that?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I will say I can draw I do something I call dress parade drawings that are fancy pencil drawings. All last summer, that's all I did. I forgot how much I liked soft pencils and that you don't have to wear shoes when you do a pencil drawing. Oh my God, I had the best summer. No one asked me to go to lunch. It was amazing. But in terms of transcribing them into glass, I want to be inspired by the glass itself. So the less information, maybe the better. So that leaves room to be inspired by the glass rather than deciding a priori what the thing is supposed to look like. I draw loose, I draw tight, I draw in between. I use a lot of whiteout in my sketchbook. I see there's
Really? Okay.
Jane Cook says in the chat that she likes my lead line with the sine curve. I said that for you. I knew.
And she also asked, Jeff, have you ever used or considered assembly with lead lines?
Ooh, lead lines is my day job right now. I'm not against the idea, but there's not been anything to really inspire me. Usually you're using lead lines to join together different pieces of glass. And the reason you would do that is because they're different colors. And you might have noticed a distinct lack of color in my work. I seem to have an issue with that. So yeah, it's something that I know how to do quite thoroughly, but I haven't yet found a need for it in what I'm doing. And so yeah, if it does come up, I'd certainly be happy to do that. But if you have any ideas, let's discuss them.
Well, Susan mentioned or reiterated that she was talking about the drawing you showed with the droopy flower. She liked it like that. Vanessa Cutler says, would you two consider swapping approaches with one another?
There's an idea.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of feel like I have a hellhound on my heels artistically. Like, if I am lucky enough to live to be in my 90s or older, I'm still going to be like, I haven't finished. So I don't feel like I can afford to swap with someone. Although, Jeff, you would be my first choice.
Oh, I would. How to answer that? Again, like Judith, you know, I kind of feel like I'm so occupied with pursuing my own direction that there would have to be a reason for me to do it. I also, you know, come on, I'm going to try and make work in the, you know, the style or technique of Judith Schaechter. There's a high bar that you need to you know, try and sail over.
I couldn't do what you do, Jeff.
And Judith does it in a way that I never could, and I love that's Judith's world that I get to look at. And
yes, and Vanessa followed it up by saying it's because you mentioned not using color.
Oh yeah, well there's that too.
Well, the
I have
red
to
brick.
use color.
You use the red in the brick, and it's so gorgeous. It's
yes.
So I love the layering in that. I would, you know, it's very, very nice. Yes.
It's gold pink. It's not just red, it is gold pink.
Do you know that gold pink is made with the blood of 1 million dead virgins? It's not red. It has to be gold pink because you know how much gold pink costs, audience? It costs the price of 1 million dead virgins.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love, is that you take this most expensive, you know, of materials and you get pink, you know, which is like, you know, the emblematic color of queerness. And so, you know, I get a bit of joy out of that.
That's
great. That is. And so there's one more question. Oops, somebody said they smashed a sheet of gold pink once.
Oh, Vanessa.
I was called to jury duty and found out that the day before that Desag was no longer going to make pink flash glass. I told the judge I had to go to Brooklyn to buy a case of pink flash glass with my life savings, so I couldn't be on the jury, and he let me go, and I did buy one. So now I'm so tight with it, I won't use it.
That's amazing, and I'm glad to hear that he let you go to get that glass. Well, there's one more question so far, but that doesn't mean people can't put another question in there. And it's thank you for sharing so much of yourselves, as both of you are academics. Do you want to speak to how COVID affected your teaching this last year?
Jeff, go first.
Oh, I'm actually not really an academic. I'm not a proper academic. I have taught within the university, but just, you know, rarely. So I'm not proper. But I did last year in February get together with a colleague and friend of mine here in Edinburgh to open a new public access glass studio. So we did that February 14th is when we got the keys. And you all know what 2020 was like. You know what happened in March of 2020. So, you know, a few weeks after getting that, you know, we had to completely shut down. So it's been a roller coaster. It's been great. You know, we have, once we were able to open up and bring students in and do the 2-meter distancing and face shields and hand sanitizer, and you know, it's felt like people's one thing that they could go out and do, you know. So I don't know what everybody's lockdown restrictions have been like, but we even had, like, there were a couple friends who I think they just came to the class because they could meet up in person in a class where they couldn't do it anywhere else legally. That's just a suspicion, but no, so for me, the whole COVID thing has been tied up into starting a new business, and the whole way in which that kind of completely occupies your brain and your time. And to throw COVID into it, it's like it's taking a really strange situation and making it stranger. I don't know. It's been it's been quite something. But Judith, how has it affected your students?
Well, at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, I'm basically teaching a seminar lecture class, and that the transfer between Zoom and in person is painful, but basically simple. It's not like I'm teaching them stained glass. Then University of the Arts closed its crafts department. I think COVID was the final straw. So I'm not expecting to teach stained glass there ever again. So I asked Tyler if they would give me a job, and they did. And so now I am an adjunct professor at Tyler School of Art. Thank you, Tyler. I love you. And
Awesome.
I had agreed to only teach in person, but COVID didn't end soon enough. And so I had to learn how to teach stained glass remotely. And that was, in some ways, it was really awful. And in some, first of all, I had to learn how to videotape myself doing demos. That's why one of the links up there that Marcy posted is for my YouTube channel. Why not share with the whole world what I made for my students? And they're terrible, but have fun watching them if you choose to do so. Teaching stained glass it was hard. But mainly the camera doesn't like to be on a light table. That was the hardest thing about it. They could have gotten me a more expensive camera, and that might have helped, but whatever. After I got my first, they were in person, by the way. And they were testing the Temple University students once a week, twice a week for COVID. They got tested, and they were socially distanced, wearing a mask. As soon as I got my first vaccine, I started going in. I never got COVID, so I guess I'm okay. And it was, they had a party for me. It was so nice. And it was wonderful to teach in person again. But I will say that I was a better one-on-one critic in Zoom than I am in person, because I felt like the one-on-one critique thing, we had such privacy, and I don't like the sense that anyone can hear us talk when we're having a private crit. I mean, I really want them private. So not in a big room, So that was actually really good. I spoke to people for much longer, and I think was more involved with them. So there were good things too. So that's about that.
Well, I think that we are out of questions. I always can ask the question about your experience with WheatonArts. So do you want to close with a little touch on WheatonArts?
I love Wheaton. I've never taken a class. I have blown glass. Sometimes people ask me that. I've never blown glass at Wheaton. Never. I was on the board for a little while, and that's my experience with Wheaton. I like to donate to Wheaton. People, consider donating to Wheaton. It's an excellent cause. I'm so pleased that you do such good work in our area in the Pine Barrens. How cool is that? If you don't know what the Pine Barrens are, Google it. And basically, I think Wheaton is a wonderful place with good people and a great mission. And they made me queen of all Millville once. They made me the Millville Rose. That was very nice of you, considering that I've never taught them. All right, Jeff.
I was hoping that you would share that, Judith.
I had a transformative residency at Wheaton for 6 weeks, I suppose it was, in 2016. And in some ways I felt like this kind of weird glass painter in a studio that's really beautifully set up for glass blowing and in so many hot processes, but the staff just kind of moved mountains to help me do what I needed to do, and gave me just lots of space and time and facilities to just explore. And I ended up, I spent a lot of the time trundling as much glass as I could carry on the public transportation system, which is not phenomenal in southern New Jersey, one must say, to go over to...
That's a lovely understatement. Thank you.
To one of the neighboring towns, I can't remember what it's called now, where they had a laser, Bridgeton or something.
Bridgeton, yes.
Bridgeton,
Wow,
yes.
good memory.
I went there a lot with loads of glass on the bus. That was lovely. But it was really, as I look back on the ways in which my practice changed after that experience, you know, it was pretty significant. And I just love that, you know, the time and the space and the ability to being surrounded by people who just say, yeah, try it, do whatever you want. So I'm very grateful to Wheaton.
Great. And I did share, I have 2 slides to share with you, but in the chat, I shared Jeff and Judith's website. I also shared the link to, and I should say that there have been a lot of lovely compliments, and I will download the chat for you. Oh, there it is. So Judith and Jeff, I want to thank you both for being here this evening, and Judith for bringing Jeff into this conversation. Jeff, thank you for your willingness to stay up so late to be with us in Scotland. We appreciate both of your humor and sensitivity and your evocative works with your unique approaches. And I thank you again, both of you, and for everyone here tonight for coming together. Thank you to our sponsors, PNC Arts Alive and AACG. I look forward to seeing everyone in the fall. And once again, thank you and have a great evening. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.